it's probably glib to say that if it was a private sector venture, it would be shut down at this stage. It's not a private sector; it's public sector, and we have to take that into account.
Hello and welcome to AgriFocus. I'm Frances McDonnell, and today we're going to be taking a closer look at why the Agricultural Consultants Association, the ACA, is concerned about what it has described as the serious decline in afforestation in Ireland. We're joined today by Andy Dunne, who together with Fionnán Russell is the co-author of a new report just published by the ACA on forestry policy, entitled Putting Landowners Front and Centre. Andy, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, good to be here.
Tell us first of all why the ACA has published this report.
Yeah, I suppose it's not surprising if you stand back and think about it. Forestry is coming to the table with a lot of, I don't want to be negative, but it's coming with a lot of historical baggage, and the report sets out that baggage over 70 years where it was a state enterprise. It was, it bought up huge chunks of farmland. Quite often there was local antagonism, and that model was carried forward when forestry was I suppose privatized in the late 80s, and it tended to take a whole farm approach. You planted the farm, you closed the gate, you went away, and you came back after 15 or 20 years to see what had happened. So the approach and the model, I suppose, disconnected farmers from their land.
Fast forward now to 2023, and we have all of our climate change obligations. There's a very important role for afforestation in meeting those targets.
Oh, huge! It's the biggest thing the land use sector can do in this country for climate change and for biodiversity. It's critical. I mean, it's government policy. Not alone is it policy, but it's law to meet our targets. And this is one of the chief vehicles of meeting it, planting more land. And it is very high on the policy agenda. The follow-up probably needs to be looked at, and that's what the report is about. It needs to be looked at in detail.
Because we haven't hit our targets.
We haven't, and we consistently haven't hit our targets. And the target we've set for ourselves of 8,000 hectares a year is considerably lower than the experts are now telling us we need to do to hit our targets. It's probably, you'll see figures from the EPA and from other sources of 18, 20, or even up to 30,000 hectares a year, which is off to scale in terms of where we are. We're barely doing 2,000 hectares a year. So there's a big gap there.
And do you think that we could say the current forestry policy has failed then?
I don't like to say that it's failed, because I think the policy is I don't have a problem with the policy, with the program. It's the implementation and the approach. If we stay doing the same thing, we're going to get the same results. So we need to make interventions that are probably quite dramatically different than we have done in the past.
And I know that the ACA has come up with what they believe could help shift policy and could help maybe inspire more farmers to actually think about forestry as an option.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose at a high level, what we're thinking there is that we fully integrate forestry with farming. We don't have it as something different, something alien. We have it as if you like, a normal farm enterprise. Now, there's a lot of institutional thinking and bureaucratic thinking to change to move that. I mean, farmers don't see forestry. They do on the continent. They see it as a farm enterprise, but there's no tradition of it here. And we have to work very hard to shift that mindset.
Is it really important that, as you talk about, it's integrated? Because it's almost seen as a standalone option at the moment, isn't it?
It's not almost. It is. It is standalone. So, so a farmer choosing to go the forestry path foregoes support that would be available on that land if it were in livestock husbandry, if it were in tillage production, if it were in normal farming management. So straight away you're asking a landowner a farmer to make a kind of counterintuitive or negative choices. He or she has to forego something to
and it's
get
a
into
huge
forestry.
commitment, isn't it?
It's
a big commitment.
Well, huge in terms of the law is if you go into forestry, you're in it in perpetuity. So you can't get back out of it. So, and I mean, that reflects in all sorts of ways. The value of land under forestry is lower than the value of land not under forestry, all things being equal. People and economies are speaking very clearly to us. These are things we have to address. We have to make it an easy and a rational choice for people. At the moment, it's not a rational choice. I mean, advisors will tell farmers, you'd be better off leasing it. You'd be better off milking cows. You're tying up your land. We have to deal with all these, I suppose, obstacles.
I suppose the first premise is that it has to pay.
Absolutely. And again, there's been a lot of kind of talk about the volume of support that's here now, and there is a good lot of money there, but we have to think long term. You as a landowner plant 10, 15 acres of hardwoods, you're waiting 100, 150 years for a return. There is support for 20 years. What happens between year 20 and year 150? And
of course, you're thinking of the next generation down. What support is going to be in place for them?
Well, this is the question. We're told that we're doing great things for the environment. We're sequestering carbon. We're improving biodiversity. Sadly, and I don't mean to be harsh or critical, but that will not create certainty for farmers who are planting. What does happen after 20 years? Nothing.
I know another aspect that the ACA has highlighted, and you've highlighted in this report, is that there can't be an exclusion from any other farm schemes if you are committed to forestry.
Yeah, no, I don't see the rationale for that. Now, I mean, all sorts of arguments will be presented that why you can and why you can't, but we have to make this work. We have to make forestry an easy choice rather than a difficult choice, or a choice for maybe philanthropists. Most landowners and farmers are not philanthropists. It's ingrained in them to get money, to get an income, to get their livelihoods from their land. And if we're compromising that, we're not helping forestry.
There's also, you've raised in this report, there's a question mark over old forestry and new forestry, and the approach to that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand that. New forestry, and speaking probably, maybe don't want to get too technical here, but new forestry planted since I think 2008 is eligible for farm support under CAP, under certain schemes, but forestry planted prior to 2008 is not. I mean,
it's the same trees, but there's a differentiation.
Yeah, why is beyond me. And the minister will wring her hands and say, "Well, it's Brussels, it's this and that." It's up to us to advance a rational, logical case. These things are blocks, simply put.
Do you think because it's so complicated and because, as you say, there's so many varying different aspects, that's what really turns farmers off forestry in the first place?
I personally think it is. I think I won't say financial disincentive, but we haven't probably adequate incentives. We're promising money for carbon, we're promising money for biodiversity, but we're not delivering. We have a complicated regulatory system that whether we like it or not is out of step with other countries in the EU. We have a very low knowledge base amongst the farming community of forestry. We have committed very limited resources to advisory. Advisory to me is like coaching teams, coaching sport. Coaching and advice has to go on consistently. and it has to go on a one-to-one basis. And we've committed very little. There is no persuasion, there is no coaxing, there is no investment in that side of things. And we need to do that as well. Those three things: better regulation, better incentives, and better support in terms of advice and coaching, I'll call it.
Do you think DAFM is the right government department to lead out in this? Because obviously, the government has launched this massive, all singing, all dancing, 1.3 billion euro forestry programme. But do you think it's time maybe to separate that? Or do you think there needs to just be a different approach within the department?
I have mixed feelings about that. I mean, DAFM have I suppose taken a bit of flack for poor performance. I don't necessarily think taking forestry out of DAFM would help, because again, it's against our own argument that forestry needs to be a farming activity. So therefore, its natural home should be, or its natural regulatory home should be in agriculture. However, if you look at Board BIA, Board Nagopal, all those things are standalone entities. They're associated with DAFM. So there is an argument there, but I'm not absolutely convinced myself. Now, the longer it goes on, that I suppose we're not getting the change that is needed, and the change is I suppose evidenced by the fact that we're not increasing the area planted. The more that goes on, the more, I suppose, the stronger the argument will be to do something and take it away from there, because obviously it's evidence that it's not working there. I
was going to say to you, when do we reach the critical time? Or are we already in the critical time? So.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, I think we haven't hit our targets for maybe 10 years. Now, certainly, it's probably glib to say that if it was a private sector venture, it would be shut down at this stage. It's not a private sector; it's public sector, and we have to take that into account. But we've had quite a number of reports. We've had quite a number of external reviews. We're still doing the same thing effectively. So,
if you were in the driving seat tomorrow morning, what's the first thing you'd do?
I think the first thing I would do is I would go back to my three cores. I would go back to the advisory and the coaching role. I would invest quite a bit there. I would revisit, and I know the department will argue that they looked at the regulatory system, but it's clearly out of step. So I would revisit that. That is, I mean, if it takes 3 years to get a forestry approval, if it takes 2 months to convert from a beef farm to a dairy farm, and there's no kind of regulatory blocks, there's something wrong. And the third thing is I would really revisit the incentives. There has to be payment for delivery of public goods, and the state has to take leadership there. The carbon market outside the state is, somebody described it lately as the Wild West, and that doesn't create certainty for landowners. So those three things I would look at: the advisory system, the incentives, and the regulation.
You've been in this business now. You've been an agricultural land use consultant for over 30 years. Mm. Do you feel confident that farmers will back this in the end?
I go back to the coaching side of things. It'll take time. It's in quite a bad place now. We know this. The numbers tell us, but we know it from being up close and personal with farmers. So I would say we have to work really hard at kitchen tables to sell this, to reassure people, to sow the seed. It'll take a little bit of time. But we have to have the background things working properly as well. So it's going to take time, and I don't think there's any magic bullet here. It's hard work, it's directed resources, and I suppose we're asking people to change. The institutions that control it have to look in the mirror and say, we need to change here as well.
So if we just go back and sort of look at key recommendations, the most important recommendation put forward in your report is what?
I would say is, it, again, probably we'll work down to them, but the most important one is that forestry becomes a farm enterprise and is treated the same as dairying, is treated the same as tillage, is treated the same as sheep rearing. That's the most important one. It's excluded, so it needs to be brought into the fold, and all the disincentives that go with taking it away from core farming have to fall away.
Is that because there isn't a whole farm approach at the moment?
No, it's neither flesh nor fowl. It's not state forestry. It's not farm forestry. It's commercial forestry.
Yeah,
we don't know where it sits. I mean, probably something I haven't touched on is the fact that farmers, we all know this, have an emotional connection with their land, and it's very intangible, but all of us that are involved are aware of this. So we must recognise that that's there, and we must do forestry in a way that recognises and supports emotional attachment. So what I mean by that is, instead of maybe supporting the afforestation of the farm is 100 acres, so we plant every last bit of it, we look at planting 20 or 30 acres, and we engage the farmer fully in the growing, the management, the thinning, the harvesting, the management of biodiversity, the management of water. We train him or her. It becomes the same as growing a crop of wheat or a crop of barley. It becomes integral to farming. It's not something else that you close the gate on and you hire somebody in 15 years to look at and tell you that it's going okay, it's going bad. You should have went in there 6 years ago. Engagement of the farmer with his or her resource is key.
Andy, we know that there's so much pressure now on land. We see that coming from all directions. Those are stories that we're covering every week in Agriland. So to ask farmers to actually take land out of the mix for forestry it's a really big cultural change, isn't it?
Oh, it is. Yeah, that's the whole focus of our paper, and I think there's no magic wand here. This is hard work. This is making it all fit with farming, engaging them, coaching them, supporting them. Most farmers will not do this, sadly, for philanthropy reasons. They'll be driven by livelihood goals.
One of the key aspects that we hear all the time is that farmers are coming under increasing pressures for being, quote unquote, climate deniers or are not environmentally responsible. And yet, they're being asked to adopt new practices and to go in a different direction, a different route. Is that too much to ask of farmers?
Well, I suppose we're all responsible for climate change. That's the starting point. And none of us can point fingers, and there's quite a bit of finger pointing going on. And I'd say, looking at it from my kind of rural perspective, there's a lot of finger pointing going on at rural Ireland, and that's fine. But farmers are threatened by that finger pointing. That's real, and people under threat tend to defend themselves and will not. Part of the problem, they won't respond well to proposals to change. Particularly when there's no incentive to, or limited incentive, in fairness. We all have a responsibility here. We probably, the debate is really polarised, around it, and farmers do feel threatened.
Yeah. And do you think, winning sort of hearts and minds on the forestry debate, does that come down, as you'd say, to better advice, better education, better understanding of what the end goal is?
I think so. I think that's a key part of it, because that's sowing the seed and the seed now is there, but it's very, if there's such a thing as very dormant. It's in the farming community, so that seed has to be nurtured and danced around and tweaked, and that will take time, as I said, but it has to be married up with good logical reasons. I had a debate sometime in the last year with a lady, and she was I think she was involved in the Save Leitrim campaign, and both of us concluded, very civilized debate, at the end of the debate, that it was illogical both of us concluded this, it was illogical for farmers to plant their land.
And are you getting any questions from farmers?
Very few. As I say, we would deal in our practice, we would deal with probably maybe 1,000 farmers on a regular basis.
And how many of them have planted forestry in the last 10 years?
In the last 10 years, up to about 10 years ago, there would have been a regular enough, I won't say a stream of queries, but there would have been a flow. There's 25,000 private landowners in the country with forestry. So there would have been a flow of people in. You'd have 8 or 10 or maybe 20 people every year, up to 10 years ago, as I say, interested that you'd refer on to a forester. In the last 10 years, it's gone down to a trickle, and in the last 2 or 3 years, it's gone down to nothing.
They've been very well rehearsed about the licenses, about moving forward in that.
Yeah, but that's a contributory factor. But we have to consider as well that maybe we have harvested the low-hanging fruit in the farming community, and that's what pushes me into our thinking around. We need the coaching, we need the advisory, we need the advisors being in a position to say, yes, John, farmer, have a think about it. It's worth thinking about. It's a good use of land. It'll secure your family. It'll create an income that you haven't heretofore had. It's good for the environment. The state is, because it's a public good, is happy to give you a few pounds.
You're really targeting farmers, or want to target farmers that have never thought of forestry before.
We have to. If you look at the numbers, in my view, we have harvested the low-hanging fruit. So we have to go into the cohort now that's slower and more cautious, and we have to convince them. Harder to convince those people.
But it is one of those aspects of farming now that's here to stay, isn't it?
I think so. Who knows? But I think so. I mean, helicoptering up to the high-level policy, not just in Ireland but globally, reforestation, afforestation. I mean, it's a tool globally to deal with carbon. It's a tool to replace concrete and steel. It may be a tool for other things around, chemicals. It's a tool for biodiversity enhancement. So I don't think there's any getting away from it. But at the moment, we're still in a kind of a slow enough place in Ireland. Do
you think Irish farmers will be slow to respond? From your dealings with farmers over the last 3 decades, does it take them time to get on board?
It's a good question. It depends, is the answer. If you look at some of the, I suppose, the agri-environmental schemes, there was huge take up, even the most recent.
Well, we knew from Acres was huge, wasn't it?
It was. But go back to the initial agri-environmental scheme reps, and there was a lot of scepticism amongst the farming community about that, and it still ended up with 50 or 70,000 people in it, which was a lot. But there was initial scepticism. But the scale of change, there was no permanent land use change involved in reps or acres or any of those things. You were doing things that, in simple terms, didn't really change the look of the place. There was good incentives. There was no, as I say, permanent change. If you put up a fence, if you planted a little hedgerow, that's a lot less impacting and a lot less permanent than planting 20 or 30 acres of oak or beech or Sitka spruce or whatever, So and that's why the work and the advisory work and the incentives and the regulation must be right here.
So you would like maybe the government to go back and have a look at what's been on the drawing board?
I would, yeah. I think there was a hope in the government and in the department and in the Forest Service that the if you like, the forest program alone, and the program is good. In its, it has 12 or 14 different types of schemes in forestry. That alone would shift thinking, but thinking is not just driven by that.
Like really, some of the farm organisations haven't been overwhelmingly backing the government's policy and what you're saying too, about how can farmers get on board and be guaranteed, because there is an aspect of, you're looking very much into the future.
Yeah, and back to the change and the management of change, you're asking people to make a dramatic change. I mean, in the last 5 or 6 years, there was one money-making venture on Irish farms, and it was very hard to go beyond that if you had land and facilities suitable for it. And that's the choice thing. It was an easy choice. You didn't have to wait 3 years to be consented to do it. You have to actually make it easier than that type of change in this case.
I think we can all agree, Andy, that there's lots of challenges when it comes to forestry and farming just at the moment. But for us, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for coming into Agriland today to chat to us on the AgriFocus podcast. And of course, if you have any thoughts or comments on what you think about forestry policy at this time, please do get in contact. And if you get the chance to rate, review and follow AgriFocus on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, we'd appreciate that. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to catching up with you again.